So I do want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Reading in the Brain, Unlocking the Sensory Foundations of Reading and Dyslexia with my good friend, Alan Heath. I want to start today just with an observation that I know many of you experience in your work or maybe even in your own family. Some children can read the words on the page. They might decode fluently. They may pass assessments. We may even be impressed with how quickly they move through text. But when you ask them what they understood from what they read, they pause, they give a vague answer, or they draw a blank, as if they hadn't read. Other children avoid reading entirely. They may shut down the moment a book appears. For them, reading isn't just something that feels hard for them, it's overwhelming. In both cases, it's easy to understand, what's missing for these kids. For decades, the approach to reading has been language-based, relying heavily on phonics, decoding strategies, or drills. But what if, truly reading readiness goes deeper in how the brain organizes sensory information, processes sound, sequences, and supports our attention and timing? We're going to be exploring this and more in today's conversation. And I couldn't imagine a better person to guide us through this topic than Alan Heath. Alan is a sensory psychologist and the founder of Learning Solutions in the UK. For over 25 years, Alan has worked with families and professionals to uncover the deeper systems that shape both learning and reading, systems that often go unseen but are absolutely essential for real change. Alan serves as our international representative for advanced brain technologies in the UK, Ireland, and the UAE, bringing the listening program to these regions and supporting professionals and families and integrating it into daily life. Alan's a respected international lecturer, a valued member of our faculty, and a trusted mentor to practitioners internationally. He helps them build strong sensory and auditory foundations for learning. Alan is the author of Beating Dyslexia a Natural Way, the co-developer of the movement program, and someone I've had the privilege of knowing and working alongside for over 2 decades now. What I've
Yes.
always admired about Alan beyond his expertise is he really has an unwavering respect for each child's journey. He helps us see that reading is not just a skill, but it's an emergent expression of a fully integrated sensory and neurological foundation. Alan, thank you for being here today. It's an honor to share this space with you.
Thank you, Alex. It's a great pleasure to be here too. It
So,
really is.
Alan, I want to start us off with really a big foundational question.
Mm.
When a child struggles with reading, especially when it's been diagnosed with dyslexia, what's often overlooked about what's really happening in their brain?
Yes, I think that's the real key question, and I think first, if we consider that, of course, a diagnosis of dyslexia or the reading difficulty is just that. It tells us about the challenge, and it's often more and is purely really a diagnosis of symptoms rather than telling us what's lying underneath that. And I think obviously reading is a learnt skill. So, we need lots of practice, we need lots of experience, we need lots of exposure. And many children have lots of practice, experience, and exposure to learning to read, being read to, and things like that, and still struggle. So I think the first thing for me is always to think about, okay, when from even before birth onwards, have we had lots of experience to nursery rhymes and being communicated to, and singing and dancing and rhythmic games and all those sorts of things, because they're of course part of the strong foundation of learning to read in the first place anyway. But I think yes, there's this cohort of, maybe, I think in the UK the figures I seem to remember are maybe 15 to 20% who get to age 11, at the end of year six, and they haven't got functional reading
Yeah.
abilities. So when we're looking at that cohort, whether they are whether they have a diagnosis of dyslexia or they have challenges with reading generally, then yeah, what we've got to look at is okay. We've done phonics, we've done lots of reading practice, we've done writing practice, we've done all these things at school, and nothing's getting through. And that's when I think, if we begin to look underneath, and obviously this is what today is about, then we need to be considering and looking at, okay, what's their rhythmic awareness and beat competency like? Um, what's their visual processing like? What's the rest of their auditory processing like? So have they got strong auditory processing skills? Uh, but also things like what's balance, coordination, movement, um, primitive reflex integration, vestibular system. There are so many different sensory and developmental areas underneath, that we really need to consider when we look at reading. And I think that as a sort of a little box is the huge important point I'd want to get across in terms of, if we're looking at reading, we don't just want to do more reading. We want to look at why and get underneath it.
Right. So reading is, more, being not to be pedantic, but it's more than the eyes in the brain. It is the complex symphony of all of these interrelated
Lovely.
systems that have to work together in lockstep in order to be a successful reader, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wicked.
So, as you know, it looks different in every child, right? So, when the diagnosis of
Mm.
dyslexia shows up, you may have 10 children, and what's going on underneath are 10 different stories.
Yes. And
So, what are signs that, a parent or a practitioner can be looking for, the clues that tell us, that really the work we need to do lies beneath?
mm, yeah, I think you're right, and that's the case with many labels, of course, because they're so wide that a label of dyslexia can mean different things in sensory terms. And I think looking at listening and auditory processing is clearly one huge area. Now, as to what we might notice from that, it is just, you've got lots of things where, children might seem to not hear what's being said, but they have the hearing tested, of course, which is quite a standard thing, I'm sure, across the world, where it's okay, that child can't pay attention and can't listen, therefore, let's send them off for a hearing test. The hearing test comes back fine. Okay. They may have a history of glue ear and ear infections or whatever else it may be, but the hearing's fine. So I think if we then assume from that that their auditory processing and listening is fine, we're making a rather large mistake there. Um, so that's certainly one thing that we want to be obviously considering. Do we seem to be able to listen well and
Mhm.
focus and attend? Um, I'd also just throw in from over the years as well. I've certainly worked with a lot of children who seem not to be paying attention and are looking out the window at school, and they keep being redirected to look at the teacher, look at what's going on, and they find it really difficult to focus visually and auditorily. And actually, clearly, when they are looking out the window, it helps them listen better. So there's, it's these different degrees, and this may be some sort of spiky profile in sensory processing as well. Um, but clearly, I mean, I'm sure we can talk a lot more about the auditory side, and we will, and looking at things like what's their rhythmic awareness, how do they move, even walking. Does it look like they've got a nice smooth walking gait or running or when they're playing games? Um, can they hit a ball? Can they ride a bike? Um, do they reverse B's and D's and P's and Q's and things like this? So that those little signs like that, um, very much point us towards what we might be looking at in terms of sensory systems. So I think I'll just throw in as well, there's something in brain gym which probably many people will know about called a lazy 8, which is an infinity symbol like this. And one of the things I will always do when I'm assessing a child is ask them to draw a lazy 8 on paper. And often what you'll see when they copy the lazy 8 that they've got there to just copy below, what you find is they can go around here, they might go straight on the bottom and then back again. So they miss this diagonal kiss X in the middle. And those tiny little things like that tell us a lot about laterality, visual, motor, vestibular function, and things like that. So I think for many that we have to, as much as possible, identify whether we're looking purely at auditory, purely at visual, vestibular, reflexes, other developmental things, or a combination of all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I think you bring up a really important point, and that's like the danger of the label, right? I think, classically it's, oh, dyslexia, there's reversals.
yeah.
Dyslexia, we can't read. And I think our understanding of sensory development and auditory processing and sensory motor systems, these foundations have helped us better understand, the scaffolding that's involved. So maybe Alan, one segue is you're talking a lot about sensory motor function and interhemispheric communication when you talk about laterality, right? And bringing both domains of the hemispheres in synchrony together for reading. Why is sensory motor dysfunction such a clue as to what's going on?
I
Where
think,
does that fit in the developmental picture?
yeah, if we want to be able to read, okay, so let's say first as well that a diagnosis of dyslexia is changing as time goes on. Um, and even, now there's a much more very much accepted that it isn't obviously just about reading. That yes, it's about attention, it's about memory and sequencing, and that yes, it's about sensory motor systems, and a diagnosis of dyslexia, if you like, often overlaps with dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and all these things. Um, so that's opening up in many ways anyway. And I think that's a lovely recognition as we're moving on, that actually sensory motor function underneath and integration, modulation of sensory information is really important to be able to look at words, scan the eyes, know what that sound is, blend sounds and words, segment sounds and words. Um, in simplistic terms, it might be, but it seems to hold quite well that when you look at interhemispheric function, the left side of the brain is the one that does decode and look at individual sounds and words, and it looks at things from a very sequential perspective, essentially. The comprehension and understanding side and the creativity and the rhythmic nature of things is sort of more a right hemisphere function, it seems. So that then stands to reason that we've got to bring both together. And that laterality can be seen across all sensory systems, of course. How well are the two ears working together to bring sound in and integrate it as
Yeah.
well.
you
So,
know moving into maybe a little bit of what do we do when we see these things take place, and
mm,
traditional approaches to reading are falling short, and we need to strengthen the systems that they're not touching. You've used the listening program, Alan, for over 20 years now. That's what brought us together in our friendship, in our professional
yeah.
career. you know, where does the listening program help strengthen these systems? Why why is this part of your standard practice in
Yeah,
helping a struggling reader?
yeah. I'll have to let's dip into auditory a bit
Let's do it.
primarily then, because I think this is for me where it's like if you've got somebody who's having difficulty reading, if you want to clinically test some of these things, you can do. You see it, you do the listening program, those things improve.
Yeah.
Obviously there's no guarantee, but they usually do.
Yeah.
So that for me is why, 20 odd years of working with the listening program later, I would still say absolutely, if we're looking at those things, that's what we've got to do. So I think one of the things to talk about first is probably take it right down to pitch perception. Okay, so obviously we need to understand the sounds to be able to read. We need to see what the sounds are and have that what's called that grapheme phoneme link. But if we look at the phonemes, the individual sounds in language, what's really clear from the research is that many with dyslexia and many poor readers, if not all, have difficulties with differentiating phonemes.
Mhm.
So if you take things like ba and da, for instance, then there's a wonderful um, tests that can be done that's called mismatch negativity. And this has been around for a few years now, and there's lots of research papers on it if you want to look it up, anybody, but what this does is it tells us about auditory discrimination at that level of a phoneme. Um, and if we take a step back even from that, what's well understood now is that babies within 2 or 3 days of being born can differentiate these language sounds. Okay, so this is between ba and ga. Okay, and it's known that at birth, and even prem babies a couple of days old can differentiate these. So what it's thought is that in the womb, from about 23 weeks in utero, we can differentiate these sounds if we can differentiate them. Now, this thing that's called mismatch negativity, how it goes is if we go ba 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 ba, then your brain picks up that sound, knows it's the same sound, so there's no response and it becomes habituated quite quickly to that sound. Okay. The negativity part of the mismatch negativity is if we throw a ga in the middle of those bars, so we've got ba 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 ga ba 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 ba, that ga ideally will jump out as something different, and the brain produces this negativity response to say, I've noticed that that's different. Now, the really good thing about that in terms of neurology, I suppose, is that we know that most people with dyslexia, most poor readers, don't differentiate between ba and ga
Mm.
or ba and da or others as well. So if we bring that out a little bit, of course, when you start looking at reading and listening behind the reading, if you can't differentiate between different phonemes, listening is going to be really difficult. When you look at that on paper, those two sounds are the same in your brain. So naturally, you're going to have difficulty reading and probably difficulty listening, but maybe not always. Um, so I think when you look at that at a level of unconscious, way below consciousness, automatic processing, what we can see from the research, the auditory neuroscience, is clearly that someone with dyslexia, someone who's a poor reader, is not differentiating those sounds. So therefore, actually, you can take that forward and say, so doing lots of phonics practice and lots of reading isn't going to make a big difference. It will make some just from the fact that they're doing that. But if we want to get to what's at the core, we want to retrain pitch perception auditory discrimination. But of course, we also can't really pull apart pitch discrimination from timing and volume and things, because necessarily they're all together.
Right.
But yeah, but there's lots of research on those sorts of areas, and others about sound changing and going up and down as well. If you want to look at the work of people like Nina Kraus, who I think is still at Northwestern University, and Usha Goswami and Jenny Thompson and people like this, which shows that tracking pitch is difficult for people with dyslexia and people with problems reading. So right in the brainstem, way below conscious awareness, if there's a sound that goes whoop, someone who's a good reader, you can visually map that
Mm-hmm.
in the brainstem, and what you see is a nice whoop, a nice line going up. Someone who isn't a good reader, that whoop is more like it's just not represented well in the brainstem. So we can take it from a phoneme level to a sound processing level as well, auditory processing, and understand that this isn't just about phonemes, this is about sound. And of course, that's for me very much where the listening program then comes in, because we know from lots of work as well that there's loads of overlaps in the brain with processing speech and music. So
Right.
we can retrain the brain to more cleanly represent sound at those lower levels of the brain. So I mean, that's just a little bit on pitch perception, which for me is an absolute convincer that, well, okay, you retrain the brain. And also, not only do you do the listening program, but get in a choir, play musical instruments, sing.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things are also wonderful for helping retrain the brain, clearly. But yes, but mismatch negativity is a wonderful thing, I think. Um,
Alan, can you, you've worked with so many kids, can you think of an example where, you had a child that had auditory processing dysfunction in some aspect or multiple aspects, and how TLP helped them? Kind of, what did you observe with them? What did that look like? Maybe even maybe even timeline. There's so many, but does one jump out to you?
uh, yes, well, obviously, I was looking at this before, and there was one girl called Molly that I worked with some years ago. Um, she was in the UK, 6 years old, um, and she was going into year two at
Right.
six up to seven. She couldn't really read. In fact, I've got some comments from her dad that I had here, so the best thing I can do is just read you it. Um, yeah, so Molly, she couldn't really read and struggled to integrate in the classroom. Her general level was that of a reception age child, so she was about 2 years behind, um, not just in reading, but other areas as well. Uh, and she had challenges with attention as well, and that's something that will often go alongside anyway. Um, she has just completed her first 10-week cycle, listening for two 15-minute sessions a day, and the transformation in her is remarkable. At her parents' evening this week, her teacher could not have been more positive. She's catching up rapidly in reading and writing, achieving a year two level. Outside of school, she's much more physically confident, um, and it's a tangible sign of a growing involvement with her peers, he then said. But he then goes on to talk about, she's now a fully integrated member of her school, whereas before, she needed lots of extra help and assistance, and she had just been transformed within 10 weeks. And that's, on the timeline of improvements, as you'll know as well. There are children who respond really quickly within a few weeks, and adults. Others who it's more slow and steady and solid, and then an odd few who it's very, very slow and steady on. But yeah, she was one of the younger children who it seemed to be like some sort of a micro intervention almost, where it just clicks, and
Mhm.
once we begin, then that can really help. So
Yeah.
I think yes, yes, it's lovely. But
Now,
if
do you recall which protocol she did?
um, she was actually on a, she did straight into level one at the time. So somebody like that now, um, when we're looking at, yeah, okay, if we're thinking of different protocols, we've got the things around reading, which are obviously, if we're looking at auditory processing as well, and we're looking at phoneme discrimination and sound discrimination, we might be looking at potentially TLP Achieve or something like that. Um, if for me as well, just as a practitioner, if we're then looking at anything around anxiety, motor skills, um, vestibular function, proprioception, balance, coordination, all those, then I would be absolutely starting with TLP spectrum
Right.
on the basis of let's ground everything, then build on top of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Alan, we're talking a lot about, really the focus on struggling readers and dyslexia.
Mm.
Um, what are, important building blocks for a typically developing child? And how do you see the listening program fitting in? I would personally love to see, the listening program incorporated into every preschool and grade school primary program, because I believe it's that foundational. But what's your
Yes.
your perspective and your experience?
I think, of course, I mean, I say to many parents when I'm working with their children, we can all always improve our auditory processing, sensory processing, calm down the nervous system, all these areas. So, I think whether we're talking about reading or life in general, then we can all always benefit. And I know you would be a great advocate of that and have always said so. So that's where I would be starting from.
Yeah.
I think one of the other big things that we must mention, to make sure we get in, is talking about timing, as well, which when we look at how timing in the brain affects reading, definitely, um, but obviously this affects visual skills, it affects motor skills, it affects
Well,
everything.
let's dig in. Let's talk about temporal processing.
So, well, yeah. So I think again, there's lots of research on beat competency, which I think is really, really important. And in terms of beat competency, if you think of a metronome beat that you're hearing, beat competency is the ability to tap to that external beat. Okay, so it's not a self-generated internal beat. It's about an external beat. And lots and lots of research over the years shows that if we have a difficulty with beat competency, we have a difficulty with reading. And again, this is represented in the brain stem as well. So it's really clear. It's below conscious awareness again. So it's something that, yes, we can practice it. Um, but if we can retrain the brain to hear beat more effectively, then that improves reading. And again, you can find that sort of research all over the internet. Um, so I think poor readers have poor beat competency. Poor readers then often have poor rhythm as well. So although speech rhythms are different to rhythm in music, that whole area of helping through music and through the listening program to train beat awareness is a really big area too. And as I say, it goes through, and I see a lot of children with dyslexia and reading problems who also have, you can see it in the body. They're avoiding sports and things like that. Generally, in fact, just to go off down a slight track here, the sport they will tend to go to, if anything, is swimming. Um, and I was speaking at a dyslexia conference a few years ago, and was talking to, I'm trying to think of his name. It might come back, but it was a Commonwealth gold medalist, UK breaststroke swimmer who'd won a medal at the games. Um, he spoke after me, so he was sat in the audience as I was talking about dyslexia, and I had people stand up and balance on one foot to see, about static balance, if that's good. He fell over, um, and then said yes, he was dyslexic, and the only thing he'd ever enjoyed doing was swimming. And I think this tells us something about the vestibular system in the ears, and how if you're in water and you somewhat, if not all, taking gravity out of the situation, then you can be a good swimmer. But anything sort of on the ground is a little bit more difficult because you've got gravity there, and the vestibular system is a lot more important in that situation. So yes, uh, I think, yeah, again, it's something. Sorry, we were talking about beat competency, weren't we? I went off a little bit.
Yeah, we were talking about temporal processing
That's
with
it. Yes,
timing, be competency.
yes, yes. Thank you for reminding. So yes, I think though, that, yeah, training it with, um, again, I would be, if I'm working with somebody like that, I would be starting. We're looking at the lower frequencies of sound. Ideally, we're looking at working with bone conduction
Yeah,
because we get those sound frequencies into the body, and lower sound frequencies um, represent vowel sounds. If we think of it back to reading, then, so there's that difference between lower frequencies of sound and, higher frequencies. If we just put a bit more on that, vowel sounds tend to be maybe up to about 500 or 600 hertz. So that's low sound. Something like a ch or a sh are about maybe 1500 or 2000 hertz. And by the time we get up to things like s and th, we're up to 6, 7, 8,000 hertz, whatever it might be, higher frequencies. So when we actually look at the model that TLP has as well, which is, okay, let's retrain the ability of the brain to process those frequencies, then those, then those, then those, then those, then those. I mean, it's so obvious as a way to retrain the ability to listen to different frequencies,
yeah,
which takes us back to mismatch negativity and things like that. The way to do it is partly to take other frequencies out, have high quality, um, with gaps, which again is, we get back to the temporal processing, because this is about millisecond gaps in
yeah,
sound as well. Um, and that reminds me of other work that's been done, again, published research, which shows that children with dyslexia and reading difficulties tend to only be able to detect gaps. And I think it was about 8.5 milliseconds, whereas good readers, you're looking at 3 or 4 milliseconds in this particular piece of research. And of course, what that tells us is it's very small, for one thing. You're talking about a few milliseconds. But if you think of discriminating words before we can read them, then if you even take a word like cat or dog, the vowel sound is always the one that's extended when we speak, and it's a lower frequency sound than, say, the C and the T in cat. So even one quick CVC word like that has got different frequencies and timing in. And what can tend to happen is what's called masking. Maybe that the A sound in the middle will block the beginning sound in the brain, or it will block the T and things like that. So what we end up with is again, the brain can't differentiate sound well. That means we can't differentiate phonemes, which therefore means, we can see the word cat, but we don't really know in the brain cleanly and clearly that that's cat, because the sound our brain is hearing is not cat.
Yeah.
It could be sat, pat. It gets them mixed up. So yeah, that's, we're into timing areas as well as pitch. Yeah. So
Well, circling back to, something that you shared in terms of the scaffolding and the structure of the listening program, for those joining that this is new, this is music listening therapy, especially recorded music and produced to developmentally train the brain for the full spectrum of frequency that we can auditorily process from 20 hertz, very low tone, to 20,000 hertz, a very high tone. And the way that it's structured is we first, from a developmental perspective, focus on the foundation of sensory motor brain areas. So we build that solid foundation. And upon that foundation, we then move into the speech and language frequencies. So the sensory motor area we called sensory integration, green zone, we move into speech and language, orange zone, then we go into the higher end red zone of the high frequencies, and then we train back down. And so we go through a process with these protocols of training the whole system, not just the areas that we break down for reading discrimination, why this is relevant for, everything that we're discussing today. And I think another component I would like to talk a little bit about, Alan, is we think about regulation, self-regulation. How important is self-regulation to reading? And where does the listening program fall in there, right? Because we're stressed, we're anxious, that
wow.
affects our attention, our processing, our ability to discriminate, our response to difficult situations. Maybe we can just take a couple minutes to get some of your perspectives there.
Mm. Yeah, and thank you for filling in the listening program. Sorry, I just
Oh,
assumed
no,
you would.
no, it's a
That's
dialogue.
great.
It's
Oh
great.
no, 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 yeah. Um, no, I think self-regulation again from a lot of the children I see, self-regulation is always an issue. Pretty much, again, whether it's in the auditory field, that they become completely overwhelmed by sound, um, that they need to remove themselves, or we end up with loops, or whatever it might be to protect the ear from sound, and that's obviously a signal that auditory processing is not good anyway. But similarly, when we look across the visual system, if we bothered too much by lights and things like that, or we have light sensitivities, then that's probably as well telling us a lot about sensory regulation. But the ability to sit still, as well, of course, which takes us into, hopefully you've all come across the vestibular system, and if you haven't, have a look into it, because it's in the ear, right next to the cochlea, and is affected by sound frequencies, very much below 1,000 hertz, hugely as well. And that system is the fundamental system that allows us to be still. So if that system is in any way dysregulated or the brain's not processing the information well, what that means, of course, is we need to be moving all the time because in my sense at least, if we stop moving, we lose an awareness of where we are
Hmm.
in the world, and we begin often to lose an awareness of where our body is in space. So we move to keep that regulation. But of course, in the classroom, again, at least, that's not a really good
That's
thing
frowned upon.
to be able to even rock, or move around or anything. So yes, clearly. Um, so I mean, there's those types of sensory regulation, but clearly as well, a lot of children with reading difficulties and with dyslexia have levels of anxiety because they find things so difficult anyway. So, when we look at into the nervous system, what we can see is that the alertness, which is the sympathetic nervous system activity, is dialed up and sort of gets stuck there. That's the fight and flight alertness. And a lot of the kids I see, I would say their systems are like this. There isn't that balance there at all. So they are naturally more on alert. They're looking for danger. And one of the other big things we need to consider, and this is yes for reading and dyslexia as well as a lot of other, is okay, how can we bring down that? Because if we can calm the nervous system, then attention is better on what we're learning rather than looking for the danger of the door that's just opened or the sound that's behind us and things like that. Um, and that whole area as well takes us really into the area of things like primitive reflexes and the moral reflex as well. That my experience of working with the listening program, because I also work with primitive reflexes, is very much that if we work with low frequency sound, and particularly if we can work with bone conduction too, the wave system, then we get that sound into the body and it calms down the nervous system. And that underpins everything for sensory and emotional regulation. So everything then becomes easier. Learning becomes easier. We're opening the door to be able to learn to read if we can calm down the emotional system.
Ultimately, like anything in life, we need to feel safe in our environment, to be
Completely.
present and to engage.
Yeah.
And I think so often, we see children, in the classroom and in their home environment that there there's a sensory processing challenge, which leads to stress and anxiousness, which
Mhm.
then will lead to attention being drawn to that into then behavioral issues. And then when the behavioral issues are addressed and the child's called out for not paying attention, and Johnny, just pay attention and read, then there's an issue with self-concept, how
Mhm.
they feel about themselves, how they develop it as an individual and interact in the world. And I think now more than ever, we need to be sensitive to that and appreciate that each one of us deserves and needs the opportunity for self-regulation. And it's
Yes.
one of the beautiful things the listening program does. When we first developed the program in the late 90s, we were really truly focused on auditory processing.
Yeah.
And what we learned is we partially got to improved auditory processing through improved self-regulation.
Yes.
It opened the door, right? It allowed
Yes.
us that
Yeah.
access. And that's part of the beauty of TLP and why it works with so many practitioners, whether it's an educational consultant, a reading specialist, an occupational therapist, a speech language pathologist, whatever the practice, it creates a ready foundation
Mm.
for whatever work that we're doing.
Mm.
One more thought, Alan, and this is just a question. We haven't discussed this, so this is a bonus question for you today.
Okay.
We now have Gen Alpha which is a heavy, heavy digitally raised generation of children. They live on their phones or their tablets. They take lots of quick visual information, lots of heavy dopamine hits to maintain attention. Do you see that as having an impact on emerging reading skills and ability today? Do you have any concern about where we're at and how that's affecting the current and future generation?
Yes, this is a quick answer. I think there's a few things that pop up immediately. One is that if we're spending time on screens, screens are by definition two-dimensional.
Hmm.
So if we look at things like developing skills of convergence and divergence for vision, then I think if we're not already seeing it, we will see many, many more visual challenges. Um, this isn't in acuity, of course, in how well can you see the chart when you have an eye test. This is about moving from book to board in the classroom. How quickly can your eyes adjust from near to far, and how well do they work together as a pair? So that's more into the area of behavioral optometry, developmental optometry, which is really important, of course, too. But of course, it's laterality as well underneath that, and it's vestibular function, because the vestibular system will move the eye muscles to keep us focused and things like that. So I, I yeah, so I think that's one area. I think just attention wise, I know there is periodically a big push generally, which is read a book, it's so important. Um, and I think that auditory side and the creative side of reading and getting into a story and visualizing the story as you read it is something that's clearly missed if we're on phones and things are moving fast, as in a lot of young children's TV as well. There's a lot of programs that are very fast and visual and sharp, and it's changing all the time. And I think that's probably likely, at least for some, to train a generation of children who need that level of input, but also become overwhelmed by it as well. So we're back to, their nervous systems are not calm and relaxed. They haven't time, and they actually haven't particularly, they're not developing the ability to do nothing for a start, and be creative. They need that input all the time, and that can't be a healthy thing.
Right. We've got three boys, 29, 25, and 15, right? So we've watched kind of this progression over time, and it
Mm,
becomes increasingly difficult for children to simply be bored
yes.
because we need that boredom, we need that space
Mm,
to be creative, to ideate, to think. And we're not giving our children a lot of space to do that today. So, it's something I'm personally paying a lot of attention to. I'm very pro technology,
yes.
but it's
Yeah,
how
me too.
that
Yeah.
technology is applied and how we're adapting to it. And we're having to adapt faster than ever. I'd love to open up the AI conversation, but we don't have time in this moment. But this is a whole other component we're dealing with really in the last 12 months
Mm,
in
yes.
raising children, being in the workforce, dealing with the educational system and what's there. But we have had a ton of questions come in. We've been folding many of those into our conversation today, but I want to dig into just a few specifics that have come in. So everyone, thank you for your input. This has been an incredibly dynamic conversation, in large part due to the questions you submitted when you registered and what's come in live, during our conversation. So I've got one for you, Alan, from Suzanne. Suzanne's 77. She suffered with dyslexia her whole life, and she wants to know, is there help for her?
Hmm. Yes, hello, Suzanne, and the answer is yes, no guarantees, of course, always. But yes, I work with many adults and people in the 60s and 70s, whether we're talking about brain injuries, vestibular challenges, dyslexia, things like this. I think the first thing to say is, of course, the brain is plastic. Neural plasticity means that we have the potential for the brain to learn new things the whole of our lives. That's what learning is. It's brain plasticity. Um, so in terms of a dyslexia side of things, again, it actually takes us back a bit to sort of, well, what is dyslexia? So what I don't know, Suzanne, is, of course, are you experiencing things that are based in the vestibular system, the visual system, the auditory system, things to do with laterality? Um, so there are a number of different approaches, I think, based on what's happening for you. What I can say is that, again, Alex was talking about these green low frequencies and things like that, that they will likely be the start point, um, to help with grounding sensory systems, improving timing and organizing things, which then we can build on uh, things from there. So I sort of can't answer it in any more detail than that. But if you want to contact ABT on me, I'm happy to carry on that conversation.
I think that's a fair and balanced response. And always if we're living the brain is plastic, there's an opportunity to learn. We're all learning and growing every day. And that's the beauty. And I believe there's an opportunity worth exploring there
Mm,
for Suzanne.
yeah,
Stepping back, Alan, there are a number of reading interventions, Linda Moot Bell, Orton Gillingham, other methodologies. How do you see the listening program being combined to support formal reading intervention?
yeah. Thank you. Whoever's asked that, thank you. Yes, because it's something we haven't looked at all, really. And I think for me, Um, I would always say, when you think of what we've talked about with things like pitch perception, timing, we haven't talked about volume or spatial awareness or anything in auditory, that all needs to be considered. Then what we should be thinking, and I would certainly say, is we start with the listening program, because all those different reading interventions, if they are based on phonics particularly, um, and blending, segmenting, sound, sequencing, all those sorts of things, then they will have much, much more of an impact when we've built auditory processing underneath and improved timing. Because I often find with people I work with, yes, they'll do other programs, but those other programs, or speech and language therapy, or whatever it might be, will suddenly begin to move a lot faster, because we've got to the foundations rather than to the level up from the foundations. And so for me, I think yes, the reading programs are important because we won't catch up and things. The listening program comes more fundamentally, and then build all those on. So it's not an either or; it's
Yeah,
both often. Yeah.
agreed. You
Mm.
know, um, a lot of parents hear this particular statement, Alan, and it's like, I hate reading. What's your recommendation on how to respond to a child that, reading has become so difficult it's a negative, or they just don't want the practice? So
Yeah.
how can we guide a parent to say something that's helpful and not detrimental in those moments?
That's such a wide question, really. I think I can almost answer it better from a personal perspective rather than a professional, as it were, in that
Great, let's go there.
I think for me it would always be okay. So if they hate reading, don't ask them to read, especially at home. read to them, speak to them. Don't be asking them to read anything. Just hold a book there and read to them. They'll be following the words and looking at the pictures anyway. So that can sort of grow from that point anyway, because then they don't have to focus on reading. They can focus on listening to the story and enjoying it.
Yeah.
So that's certainly probably the biggest thing I would say there. And the other thing is think about not reading again, but think about what's needed for reading. So play games, again, not phonic games or anything like that, because they'll click that that's about reading. Just play games that are to do with rhythm and music and anything, because if it's
Be a
anything
drum.
with sequencing, yeah,
You've got your in time drum in the background.
yes, drumming, yeah, and call and response, drumming, singing, just play, but you can play with the knowledge if it's to do with pitch, rhythm, beat, laterality. You're going to be helping them love reading at some point in their lives, or at least if they don't get to be loving reading, they can become functional readers that can then choose. They can read enough so they can get by, at least. Because there is all the motivation side and all the rest as well. We're not, and I don't think you would be saying either, would you, Alex? We can't do all these things underneath and expect that every reader is suddenly going to be consumed by books and things. Although I certainly work with children like that as well. So yeah,
I think to live in an environment where reading is the norm, right? Modeling, you know,
yes,
um, a home filled with books tends to lend itself to more readers in households than opposed to those that are filled with screens. Just very fundamentally, environment has an impact. What we see, we model, and I think that that's a great way to conclude, Alan. This was a rich conversation. I see new possibilities. I know our audience feels the same way. To everyone joining us, I want to thank you for being here, and do just stay for a quick announcement before we go. But we hope you're leaving with some perhaps new perspectives, better questions to ask those that you're going to support in your own work, and some practical ideas for those family members or those that you work with. To learn more about Alan's work and to follow his work, please visit Learning Solutions website, which is learning-solutions.co.uk. And check out his book, Beating Dyslexia a Natural Way. Uh,
I'd have to say that's well out of print. It was written 28 years ago.
well, where do we go now, Alan?
Yeah, you probably can't find that. But of
Okay,
course,
we
in
need a
in the
fresh
last,
book.
yes,
Time.
so,
It's time. To learn more about or get started with the listening program, visit advancedbrain.com. If you're in the UK, Dubai, Ireland, reach out to learning-solutions.co.uk on that side of the pond. But advancedbrain.com, you can email us at info@advancedbrain.com, or call us at +1 801 622 5676. And you can follow us on Instagram. At Advanced Brain Technologies is our handle. Alan, thank you again for spending your evening with us. This
ah,
was
a pleasure.
incredibly informative and always great to spend time with you, my friend.
It's a great pleasure.
Yeah.
Great.
Be well, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.